All right. The Comte de Saint Germain, the Wonder Man of Europe. The Pompadour was content. Louis XV had found a new amusement. In fact, she had found it for him. The king's ennui was dispelled without an intrigue or a new mistress. Comte de Saint Germain was his new divertissement. Louis was amused and thrilled by turns. Never before had so extraordinary a person trod the sacred precincts of Versailles. The whole court was topsy turvy, and miracles were the order of the day. Courtiers of depleted fortunes envisioned the magical multiplication of their gold, and grandames of certain age had dreams of youth and favor restored by the mysterious count's fabled elixirs. Had he not taken flaws from precious stones for the king and even rolled several small diamonds into one big one? And as to his panacea for age, did he not give some of this remarkable medicine to the Countess de Gergy? And was she not now called the old everlasting Countess, whom death must have certainly forgotten upon the earth? Here was a man worth cultivating. Of course, a person who thus completely eclipsed even the notables about him could scarcely fail to create jealousy. Certain courtiers hated him heartily, but they had to keep their feelings to themselves, for the king was championed the illustrious count and would tolerate no criticism either of his person or conduct. If Saint Germain had been given to amours, it would have gone hard with him, for the bitterest enmities of that period grew out of such irregularities. But as he remained aloof from all entanglements and was always the patron, never the patronized, he maintained his position secure amid the crumbling of empire. From Souvenirs sur Marie Antoinette by Madame la Comtesse de Adamar, we have an excellent description of the Count whom Frederick the Great referred to as the man who does not die. It was in 1743 the rumors spread that a foreigner, enormously rich, judging by the magnificence of his jewelry, had just arrived at Versailles. Where he came from, no one has ever been able to find out. His figure was well knit and graceful. There it goes. Hold up. His hands delicate, his feet small, and the shapely legs enhanced by well-fitting silk stockings. His neither garments, which fitted very closely, suggested a rare perfection of form. His smile showed magnificent teeth, a pretty dimple marked his chin, his hair was black, and his glance soft and penetrating, and oh, what eyes! Never have I seen their like. He looked about 40 or 45 years old. He was often to be met within the royal private apartments, where he had unrestricted admission at the beginning of 1768. It was in the court of Versailles that the Comte de Saint Germain was brought face to face with the aged Countess de Gergy. I guess it's Gergy. Upon beholding the celebrated magician, the aged lady stepped back in amazement, and the following well authenticated conversation thereupon took place between the two. 50 years ago, the Countess said, I was ambassadress of Venice, and I remember seeing you there looking just as you do now, only somewhat riper in age, perhaps, for you have grown younger since then. Bowing low, the Count answered with dignity, I have always thought myself happy in being able to make myself agreeable to the ladies. Madame de Gergy then continued, you then called yourself the Marquis Balletti. The Count bowed again and replied, and the Countess de Gergy's memory is still as good as it was 50 years ago. The Countess smiled. That I owe to an elixir you gave me at our first meeting. You are really an extraordinary man. Saint Germain assumed a grave expression. Did this Marquis Balletti have a bad reputation? He asked. On the contrary, replied the Countess, he was in very good society. The Count shrugged his shoulders expressively, saying, well, as no one complains of him, I adopt him willingly as my grandfather. The Comtesse de Hammer was present during the entire conversation and vouches for its accuracy in every detail. The reference to the Marquis Balletti is a reminder of the many names and titles affected by this polyamorous individual. Mrs. Cooper Oakley discovers him under such various appellations as Marquis de Montferrat, Comte Belmar, or Count Aymar at Venice, Chevalier Schoning at Pisa, Chevalier Weldum at Milan and Leipzig, Comte Soltök at Geneva and Leghorn, Graf Zoragi at Schwalbach and Tresdorf, Prince Ragozicki at Dresden, and Comte de Saint-Germain at Paris. To the above list, it may be added that he has been connected with the mysterious Count de Gabrielis, who appeared to the Abbé Villers and delivered several discourses on submundane spirits. Nor is it impossible that he was the same as the remarkable Signor Galaudy, whose exploits Hargrave Jennings recounts in his book, The Rosicrucians, Their Rites and Mysteries. It is also of interest to note that in his memoirs, Casanova indirectly links Saint Germain with the activities of a Society of the Rose Cross, which was intriguing the minds of the curious during his day. The smallest doings of so unusual a person as Saint Germain would, of course, be meticulously noticed. So we discover some interesting and amusing notes relative to the establishment maintained by him in Paris. He had 2 valets de chambre, one of whom had been in his service for 500 years, a circumstance that raised the eyebrows of the skeptics. The other was a Parisian engaged for his knowledge of the city and other useful information. Besides this, his household consisted of 4 lackeys in snuff-colored livery with gold braiding. He hired a carriage at 500 francs a month. As he often changed his coats and waistcoats, he had a rich and expensive collection of them, but nothing approached the magnificence of his buttons, studs, watches, rings, chains, diamonds, and other precious stones. Of these he possessed a very large value and varied them every week. The valet of long apprenticeship is heard from on one occasion. The comte was relating an antecedent regarding his own experience at some remote time, and suddenly failing to recollect clearly what he considered a relevant detail, he turned to the valet and said, "Am I not mistaken, Roger?" And the good man replied, "Monsieur le Comte forgets that I have only been with him for 500 years. I could not, therefore, have been present at that occasion. It must have been my predecessor." From this general outline of the Parisian activities of the eccentric but illustrious Count, we turn to the consideration of those rare personal gifts through the exercise of which he gained so wide a sphere of influence. Even his most relentless detractors admit that the Comte de Saint-Germain was possessed of almost incredible attainments in every department of learning. Madame de Pompadour extols the genius of Saint Germain in the following words: "A thorough knowledge of all language, ancient and modern, a prodigious memory, erudition of which glimpses could be caught between the caprices of his conversation, which was always amusing and occasionally very engaging, an inexhaustible skill in varying the tone and subjects of his converse, in being always fresh and infusing the unexpected into the most trivial discourses, made him a superb talker. Sometimes he recounted antecedents of the court of Valois or the princes still more remote, with such precise accuracy in every detail as almost to create the illusion that he had been an eyewitness to what he narrated. He had traveled the whole world over, and the king lent a willing ear to the narratives of his voyages over Asia and Africa, and to his tales about the courts of Russia, Turkey, and Australia. He appeared to be more intimately acquainted with the secrets of each court than the charre d'affaires of the king. In the memoirs, in his memoirs, the Italian adventurer Jacques Casanova de Sangalt makes numerous references, most of them of somewhat slighting nature, to his acquaintance with Saint Germain. Even he admits, however, that his adept of magic was a skilled linguist, musician, and chemist who won the favor of the ladies of the court, not only by the general air of mystery surrounding him, but by his surpassing skill in preparing pigments and cosmetics by which he preserved for them at least a shadow of swift departing youth. We can well understand how so fascinating a character could relieve the boredom of a king who had spent his life as a martyr to royal fashions and was deprived by his position of the pleasure of honest work. Then again, rulers become victims to the fads of the moment, and Louis himself was dabbling in alchemy and other occult arts. True, he was only a dilettante. Debutante? It's not no dilettante whose will was not strong enough to bind him to any lasting purpose, but Saint Germain appealed to several qualities in the royal nature. Throughout his long career in the political centers of Europe, Comte de Saint Germain was renowned for his honesty and outspokenness. One day at Versailles, when Germain and the king were walking through a long gallery, the Comte spoke. To entertain any esteem for any man, sire, he said, one must be either a confessor, a minister, or yet a lieutenant of police. You may well add, Count, replied Louis XV, or a king. Do you know why, sire? The magician asked. Did your majesty see the thick fog which prevailed yesterday in Paris? Well, the fog which false friends and ministers cast around a king is thicker still. Saint Germain's jewels and his consummate skill in matters of art, both as a technician and a critic, also endeared him to the king. The Pompadour writes, he enriched the cabinet of the king by his pictures of Velasquez and Murillo, and he presented to the Marquis the most precious and priceless gems. For this singular man passed for being fabulously rich, and he distributed diamonds and jewels with astonishing liberality. As an art critic, he could instantly detect the most cleverly perpetrated forgeries. In music, he was equally a master. While at Versailles, he gave concerts on the violin, and on at least one occasion during his eventful life conducted a symphony orchestra without a score. He was constantly assisting his friends and found time in his busy life to instruct Anton Mesmer in the rudiments of mesmerism and to initiate Count Cagliostro into the Egyptian rite of Freemasonry, as Cagliostro himself testifies in his memoirs and authentic. To convince his friends that he actually possessed the alchemical powder of projection, by which it is possible to transmute base metals into gold, he actually performed this feat on at least 2 occasions, as attested by the writings of contemporaries. The Marquis de Valbel, visiting Saint Germain in his laboratory, found the alchemist busy with his furnaces. He asked the Marquis for a silver franc piece and, covering the coin with a black substance, exposed it to the heat of a small flame or furnace. M. de Valbel saw the coin change color until it turned a bright red. Some minutes after, when it had cooled a little, the adept took it out of the cooling vessel and returned it to the Marquis. The piece was no longer of silver, but of the purest gold. Transmutation had been complete. The Comtesse de Admeher had possession of this coin until 1786, when it was stolen from her secretary. Casanova records a similar incident in which Saint Germain changed a 12 sols piece into a pure gold coin. Being a doubting Thomas, Casanova declared that he felt sure that Saint Germain had substituted one coin for another. He intimated so to Saint Germain, who replied, "Those who are capable of entertaining doubts of my work are not worthy to speak to me," and bowed the Italian out. This is the last time that Casanova ever saw the Count. Both of these writers of memoirs fail to tell us whether the denomination stamped upon the coins was changed by the alchemical process or whether only the metal was affected. If the denominations of the coins remained the same and only the metal changed, the possibility of substituting a gold coin for the silver one would be negated, unless it is supposed that a counterfeit gold coin had been prepared in a mold made from a silver one. To assume that the dates and general appearance of the coins should match and thus make the substitution unnoticed is presuming a greater degree of skill on the part of Saint Germain than the actual transmutation of the metals would have entailed. There are too many authentic cases of metallic transmutation to condemn Saint Germain for such a feat. The Leopold Hoffmann medal, which is still in possession of that family, 2/3 of which was transformed into gold by the monk Wenzel Seeler, leaving the rest silver, which was its original state, is the most outstanding example of this transmutation of metals recorded. In this case, fraud was impossible, as there was but one copy of the metal extant. The ease at which we condemn as fraudulent and unreal anything which transcends our understanding has brought unjustified calumny upon the names and memories of many illustrious persons. Nearly all writers on the life of Saint Germain have noted his peculiarities with regard to eating. He was frequently a dinner guest. Casanova notes of Madame de Gourgy coming to the table upon the arm of his mysterious man. Saint Germain, however, seldom, if he ever ate, but throughout the entire meal entertained the other guests with tales of magic and sorcery, unbelievable adventures in remote places, and intimate episodes from the lives of the great. Casanova goes so far as to say that he followed the Count's example, being too engrossed in listening to touch his own food. In one of his tales concerning vampires, Saint Germain mentioned in an offhand way that he possessed the wand or staff with which Moses brought water from the rock, adding that it had been presented to him at Babylon during the reign of Cyrus the Great. The memoir writers admitting themselves at a loss as to how many of the Count's words could be believed, common sense as the word was then defined, suggested that most of the accounts must be fashioned from whole cloth. On the other hand, his information was of such precise nature, and he was also learned in every respect, that his words carried both weight and authority. The popular belief that Comte de Saint Germain was merely an adventurer is not supported by even a shred of evidence. He was never detected in any subterfuge, nor did he betray even the slightest degree the confidence entrusted to him. With his great wealth, for he was always amply supplied with this world's goods, was not extracted from those with whom he came in contact. Every effort to determine the source and amount of his fortune was fruitless. He made use of neither bank nor banker, but moved in a circle of unlimited credit, which was neither questioned by others nor abused by himself. Referring to the attacks upon his character, H.P. Blavatsky wrote in the Theosophist of March 1881, "Do charlatans enjoy the confidence and admiration of the cleverest statesmen and nobles of Europe for long years, and not even at their deaths show in one thing that they were undeserving?" Some encyclopedists, see New American Encyclopedia 226, say he is supposed to have been employed during the greater part of his life as a spy at the courts at which he resided. But upon the evidence is this supposition based? Has anyone found it in any of the state papers in the secret archives of either of those courts? Not one word nor one shred of fact to build this base calumny upon has ever been found. It is simply a malicious lie. The treatment this great man, this pupil of Indian and Egyptian hierophants, proficient in the secret wisdom of the East, has had from Western writers is a stigma upon human nature. No one questioned the noble birth of Clemente de Saint Germain. His whole personality bore the indelible stamp of gentle breeding. He moved graciously and gracefully, with perfect poise and self-confidence in the midst of the exclusive and aristocratic circles. He was eccentric, yes, but a gentleman always. Only centuries of culture and high breeding could have produced a man so utterly poised and to the manner born. A London publication makes the following brief analysis of his ancestry. Did he in his old age tell the truth to his protector and enthusiastic admirer, Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel? According to the story told by his last friend, he was the son of Prince Ragosi of Transylvania and his first wife, Atekli. He was placed, when an infant, under the protection of the last of the Medici, Guillaume Gaston. When he grew up and heard that his two brothers, sons of the Princess Hesse-Rensfels of Rothenburg, had received the names of St. Charles and St. Elizabeth, he determined to take the name of their holy brother, St. Germanus. What was the truth? One thing alone is certain, that he was the protege of the last Medici. Caesar Cantu, librarian at Milan, also substantiates the Ragosi hypothesis, adding that Saint Germain was educated in the University of Siena. Casanova describes a meeting with Saint Germain, which occurred in Belgium under most unusual circumstances. Having arrived at Tournai, Casanova was surprised to see some grooms walking spirited horses up and down. He asked to whom the fine animals belonged, and was told to the Comte de Saint Germain, the adept, who has been here a month and never goes out. Everybody who passes through the place wants to see him, but he makes himself visible to no one. This was sufficient to excite the curiosity of Casanova, who wrote requesting an appointment. He received the following answer: "The gravity of my occupation compels me to exclude everyone, but in your case I will make an exception. Come whenever you like, and you will be shown in. You need not mention my name nor your own. I do not ask you to share my repast, for my food is not suitable to others, to you least of all, if your appetite is what it used to be." At 9 o'clock, Casanova called and found that the Comte had grown a beard 2 inches long. This circumstance is enlarged upon by one writer to the following proportions: "The Cavalier de Sagalt Casanova finds the Count in an Armenian robe and pointed cap, with a long beard descending to his waist, an ivory wand in hand, in fact, the complete makeup of a necromancer. It seems that the growth of the Count's whiskers was indeed greatly stimulated by the pen of this writer. Casanova reports that Saint Germain had a number of retorts before him filled with chemicals in various stages of digestion. The Count stated that he was experimenting with colors for his own amusement, possibly completing the experiment commenced by him at Chambord in the laboratory constructed and equipped for him by Louis XV. He was so successful that Van Loo, the French artist, begged him to divulge the secret of his brilliant colors, but he refused. Saint Germain is also accredited with having secured astonishing results in painting jewelry by mixing powdered mother of pearl with his pigments. What occurred to his priceless collection of paintings and jewels after his death or disappearance is unknown. Continuing his discussion with Casanova, the now bearded Count explained his presence in Belgium by stating that Count Cobenzl, the Austrian ambassador at Brussels, desired to establish a hat factory and that he was taking care of the details. Upon his telling Saint Germain that he was suffering from an acute disease, the Count invited Casanova to remain for treatment, saying that he would prepare 15 pills which in 3 days would restore the Italian to perfect health. Casanova writes that he showed me his magistrum, which he called Aether, Athor, ether. It was a white liquid contained in a well stopped phial. He told me that this liquid was the universal spirit of nature, and that if the wax of the stopper was picked even so slightly, the whole contents would disappear. I begged him to make the experiment. He thereupon gave me the vial and the pin, and I myself picked the wax when, lo, the phial was empty. Casanova, being somewhat of a rogue himself, doubted all other men. Therefore, he refused to permit Saint Germain to treat his malady. He could not deny, however, that Saint Germain was a chemist of extraordinary skill, whose accomplishments were astounding, if not practical. The adept refused to disclose the purpose for which these chemical experiments were intended, maintaining that such information could not be communicated. From the Memoirs de mon Temps of Charles Landgrave of Hesse Cassel, we gain several particulars concerning the last years before the death or disappearance of the Hungarian adept. Charles was deeply concerned with occult and Masonic mysteries, and a secret society of which he was the moving spirit held occasional meetings upon his estate. The purposes of this organization were similar to, if not identical with, Cagliostro's Egyptian rite. In fact, after studying the fragments left by Landgrave, Cagliostro's contention that he was initiated into Egyptian masonry by Saint Germain is proved beyond a reasonable doubt. The Wonder Man, as Saint Germain had been termed, attended at least some of these secret meetings, and of those he met and knew during life, he confided more in Prince Charles than in any other man. The last years of Saint Germain's known life were therefore divided between his experimental research work in alchemy with Charles of Hesse and the mystery school at Louislund in Schleswig, where philosophic and political problems were under discussion. According to popular tradition, it was on the family estate of Prince Charles that Saint Germain finally died at a date given out as 1784. The strange circumstances connected with his passing led us to suspect that it was a mock funeral similar to that given the English adept Lord Bacon. Again quoting H.P. Blavatsky, is it not absurd to suppose that if he really died at the time and place mentioned, he would have been laid in the ground without the pomp and ceremony, the official supervision, the police registration, which attended the funeral of men of his rank and notoriety? Where are these data? He passed out of public sight more than a century ago, yet no memoir contains them. A man who so lived in the full blaze of publicity could not have vanished. If he really died then and there and left no trace behind, moreover, to this negative, we have the alleged positive proof that he was living several years after 1784. He is said to have had a most important private conference with the Empress of Russia in 1785 or 1786, and to have appeared to the Princess de Lamballe when she stood before the tribunal a few minutes before. She was struck down with a billet, and a butcher boy cut off her head. And to Jean d'Aubière, the mistress of Louis XV, as she awaited on her scaffold at Paris the stroke of the guillotine in the days of terror of 1793. It should be added that the Comte de Chalons, on his return from an embassy to Venice in 1788, said that he had conversed with Comte de Saint Germain in the square at St. Mark's the evening before his departure. The Comtesse de Admire also saw and talked with him after his presumed decease, and the Encyclopedia Britannica notes that he is reported to have attended a Masonic conference several years after his death had been reported. Comte de Saint Germain has unfortunately left but 2 or 3 literary fragments. He is known to have had a copy of the Vatican manuscript on the Kabbalah, presumably the finest work of its kind extant, and the Bibliothèque de Troyes containing a manuscript Lettres Sainte Trinosophie, which has been attributed to the pen of this extraordinary man. This manuscript is beautifully written and illustrated with 12 miniatures in color and is regarded as a unique and priceless document. In Le Musée des Sources by Grilot de Givry appears the following note on this manuscript, which is described as a book of Kabbalized alchemy. This volume, artistically written, was brought at one of the sales in Messina, and carries at the head of it a note of a philosopher whose name is IBC Philothome, who announces that this manuscript once belonged to and is the only existing copy of the famous Trinosophie of Count de Saint Germain. He adds that Cagliostro had also possessed this volume at one time, but that the Inquisition seized it in his home at Rome when he was arrested at the end of 1789. Cagliostro and his wife had been visiting the Count de Saint Germain in the chateau of Holstein. The true purpose for which Saint Germain labored must remain obscure until the dawn of a new era. Homer refers to the golden chain by which the gods conspired to bind the earth to the pinnacle of Olympus. In each age appear some few persons whose words and actions demonstrate clearly that they are of an order different from the rest of society. Humanity is guided over critical periods in this development of civilization by mysterious forces such as were personified in the eccentric Comte de Saint Germain. Until we recognize the reality of the occult forces at work in everyday life, We cannot grasp the significance of either the man or his work. To the wise, Saint Germain is no wonder, but to those who are limited by belief in the inevitability of the commonplace, he is indeed a magician, defying the laws of nature and violating the smugness of the pseudo-learned. Wow. Great.